Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Keela Flores with IABC. Welcome to today's webinar, How to Get Employee Attention When Everyone's So Busy. And I do apologize for any technical error anyone had in joining the webinar today. Zoom was down for a bit, but now we're back up and running. So thank you for your patience. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Feel free to submit written questions at any time using the chat window located in the lower right side of your screen. We will go over all questions at the end of the webinar. Our speakers today are Philip Nunn and Rob Drazen. Philip is General Manager of SnapComms, a global leader in employee communication software. In this role, he leads an international team of internal communication experts who specialize in helping major organizations meet the increasingly complex challenge of effective employee communication. Originally from the UK and now based in New Zealand, Philip has a background in product innovation, business development, and customer service, an ideal blend for understanding and resolving the multifaceted challenges of employee engagement today. Rob is president of internal communications agency Trident Communications LLC. Rob brings broad internal, corporate, and B2B experience to the panel. Innovation has been the hallmark of Rob's career, and he has co-founded several online and traditional communication companies. Rob is also active in the professional community, serving 2 terms as president of the New York chapter of IABC and as board member for the past 9 years. And now I'd like to turn it over to Philip and Rob.
Thank you very much, Keela. Good morning, everyone. And again, apologies for any technical difficulties that you may have encountered in joining this webinar. I said good morning. I'm based in Auckland, New Zealand. I would like to say sunny Auckland, New Zealand, but unfortunately it's not particularly sunny this morning. It's just gone 8 o'clock here, so I hope you don't mind that I've got my coffee in front of me here. For those of you not familiar with SnapComms, we're in the business of getting employee attention. So we bypass email and push messages directly to employees in a variety of engaging ways. As I said, I'm based in Auckland, New Zealand, but we've got offices in the US and in London in the UK. I'm joined today by my colleague Rob. Rob's based on the East Coast US, New Jersey, president of Trident. Rob, do you just want to say a quick hello?
Hi, good morning and afternoon to all. Happy to be here.
Cool. Okay, so I think you've already seen us anyway, but here's our little shots on the wall here. But let's get straight into the agenda. So what we wanted to look at today is the workplace today is pretty terrifying, but it's also pretty exciting. And really never before has there been so much information coming our way, but also never before has there been so much pointless distraction. So what this means is that internal communicators must really carefully juggle how they get important information out to staff without really overloading or annoying them. So we're going to take round about 40-45 minutes, we think, to run through this presentation. We're going to cover the trends and catalysts within internal comms. We're going to look at the cost of poor internal communications, and then we're going to take a look at the top three of the top communication challenges that we see today. We're going to run a poll sort of about a third of the way through this presentation. And as Keela mentioned, if you've got any questions, feel free to submit them as we go through this presentation, and Rob and I will get through to them at the end of this presentation. So the way we're going to run this is I'll run the first few slides, probably the first 9 or 10 slides, then I'll hand across to Rob, and then we'll kind of tag team between us as we go. So let's get going. And firstly, people have dramatically changed how they live and work. And so then is really just a generation ago. And, employees were looking for stable roles with a company that they could stay at for a lifetime. They wanted a pretty clearly defined career path, and they typically worked a 9-to-5 role. But now we find that, the generation of today wants to understand a company's purpose. They want fulfillment from their role. What does their company stand for? What are its values and its aspirations? And to attract and retain real talent, an exciting company culture is really a major influence on how attractive a particular work position is. And of course, technology has been a major catalyst for this change. All you need now is a simple network connection. Employees can work from a cool little cafe down the road, or the comfort of their own home, or obviously in an office environment. And people have a much greater ability of freedom of movement. As Keela mentioned, I started off in the UK. I then moved I was born in the UK, I worked in the UK for a number of years, and then I moved across to New Zealand around about 4 years ago. And so there's this greater ability of movement of employees. And in fact, if you look over the SnapComms offices, then we've only got a few true Kiwis, a few New Zealanders. We've got employees from India, Europe, the US, South America, etc., and all of which bring their own culture to our office environment. And I think when you look at the global trends, everyone's pretty well aware of millennials in the workplace. They're well covered, but we need to ensure that we cater for all of the different generations that exist within our workplace. So, there are things like social changes. So, two-parent working households, which brings its own challenges. People want to work from home. They want to do non-standard hours, etc. And generally, organizational structures are much more fragmented than ever before. We've got a real blend of remote workers in multiple time zones operating across all sorts of different devices. And it's estimated that by 2020, so just over 2 years away, 3/4 of the US workforce will be mobile workers. Now, of course, the issue of email and information overload generally is pretty well understood. The average worker, it's said that they receive 122 emails per day, but I must admit that seems a little light in my view. I think we get a few more than that. But there's also an increased use of what we call consumer-led technology within the corporate workplace, which also brings its own challenges. If we look at collaboration tools or social enterprise tools, how do you harmonize this mixture of moderated and collaborative channels? Do you even moderate at all, or do you simply allow them to run free? And so, when you look at what's happened in internal comms, well, fundamentally, the role of internal comms has been very much elevated in the workplace. We're now seen often in an advisory capacity at board level, and we're much more proactive as opposed to reactive. And consequently, there's a whole plethora of employee engagement products that offer to deliver solutions that improve staff engagement. Now, whether they be mobile solutions, PC-based, and so on. But there's also an ever-increasing amount of distraction, which you can of course be driven by the shiny new objects themselves. And this results in a real problem being able to understand, your prioritization of communication. So which channels do we respond to first? How do we want our employees to engage in that regard? Now, a good example is Workplace by Facebook. It's a nice, shiny new object, but is it the right type of tool for the work environment? And very often these tools are introduced without any real evaluation and pretty limited supervision, and certainly from an ongoing perspective. And I think lastly, it goes without saying that, staff expectations have changed within the work environment. We talked earlier about the consumer universe being introduced to the corporate world, and our employees expect a much richer media experience, which isn't necessarily the case with the internal communications that we currently produce. So, but hey, guess what? Eureka. Finally, it's been proved widely, and it's pretty much accepted that effective communication really does improve engagement and financial performance. And I guess this is something you guys have pretty much known all along, but the rest of the organization is really only just waking up to this fact. So we've got some recommended reading here. We quote these reports throughout this presentation. So you've got the ROI Communication Benchmark, the Willis Towers Watson Report, the Aon 2017 Trends, and the Workplace and Communications Technology Report 2017. But what there's a number of high quality reports that are now available, and these reports really give you the ability to prove that an investment in internal comms gives a genuine, tangible business return. But I guess consequently, more than ever, that means that the spotlight is on internal comms. And so when you look at global employee engagement, and different surveys show different numbers, but generally it's about a third of your workforce that is engaged. The remaining 2/3 aren't. So what this means is that this 60-odd% of your workforce are potentially not as productive as they could be. And interestingly, it's actually getting worse. So the latest survey from Aon, 2017 survey, showed a fall of 2% year on year for employee engagement. So you've got to think, well, why is that? And there's a lot of external factors which are influencing internal engagement as they introduce anxiety into the workplace. So political change, both domestically and internationally. So things like Brexit, continental Europe, the recent election in France, for example, as well as the US election a few months ago. And the whole dialogue here has changed from inclusiveness to one of protectionism and isolationist. So we're talking here about restrictions in labor flows, the building of walls, and so on. And I guess if that isn't enough on its own, then, looking at the technology advances that have been made, so real rapid advances in technology that could make, many jobs obsolete, that no longer the subject of science fiction. They're very much here to stay. Driverless cars, drones, VR, virtual reality, AI, machine learning, and other types of technologies, they're really competing for jobs like they never have before. And these changes really represent new challenges for organizations and leaders within those organizations. And left unaddressed, populism and the more sophisticated technology advances we've just spoken about will create further anxiety and angst within organizations. And thus, I guess we can see that work experience and employee engagement will decline even further. And so what are some of the key takeaways here? Well, the 2017 Workplace and Communications Technology Report, this was an analytical study of how time is used in the workplace. And they looked at time spent each day on different communication tasks and how they rated the efficiency of those tasks. So you're talking here about reading, replying to emails, phone calls, text, instant messenger, conference calls, etc. And they found that approximately $15,000 per employee per year is wasted due to inefficient communications. And clearly this can be improved by using the most appropriate, most optimum communication medium. Now, I said approximately 2/3 of your workforce are not as productive as they could be. And we know that there's a proven direct linkage between financial return and employee engagement. So there's a huge area of opportunity for change here. And the ways in which our employees consume media has changed. So consequently, what they've come to expect within the work environment, largely speaking, companies have been pretty slow and limited in understanding these changes and what they mean for their workforce. And there's a real need to adopt new tools and strategies going forward. So it's here that we come to our first poll. So I'm just going to launch this poll. And what we're really looking to understand is, following on from my last comment, really, has your organization consciously changed the way it communicates in what I've loosely termed this new world? And I guess the key here is whether you've consciously made that decision to be able to change the way that you communicate within this new environment. So I'm just going to launch this poll, and hopefully I will start to see some answers come through. I'll just leave that running for a few seconds. I can see that we're all voting pretty even at the moment. That's interesting. It's actually, well, yeah, at the moment we're kind of on 59% yes and 41% no. So it's kind of 60-40 split, I guess, with the people that have voted so far. So we're certainly in favor of the ones that have, and I guess that's probably to be expected with the audience that we've got. So I'm just going to end that polling, and we'll keep going. But the result was 60-40, pretty much bang on, and that was represented around about 62% of the vote. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so I'm just going to keep going with our presentation. So how do communicators respond to this then? Well, employee media preferences have changed. As we've said all along, there's this pervasion of the consumer universe into the corporate world. Employees have options to engage or not with company communications. Your executive communications, they can be pretty easily validated, and it's no longer possible to spin your employees. We can't fudge the metrics either. Everybody wants honest, transparent reporting, be that good or bad. And consumer media preferences have simply become part of the corporate landscape. And this is especially true amongst younger workers that we see. So I guess it's time to look at new tools and strategies that extend beyond the traditional email channel. So we need to consider a new model, one that resonates with the preferences of our employees. And generally speaking, attention spans are much shorter, and employees are sensitized to shorter bursts of information. So bite-sized video pieces as opposed to a 5-page company handbook, for example. So it's snackable content. And think of videos in your typical, personal Facebook feed. I mean, how often do you watch past a minute or two of those? So we're very much used to that type of short burst snackable content. And there needs to be a combination of in-your-face, or what we call disruptive messaging, as well as absorbed or background information. And don't forget, we're still catering here for the multi-generations that exist within our workforce. So a combination of what we could consider new style and old style is required. So digital and print, for example. And the key here is balance, variety, accessibility, so short chunks, snackable content, as well as repetition. And when we look at the communication spectrum, so from top down and from left to right, so top down communications through to collaboration tools, and then from passive to intrusive, then depending on the nature of that task, there's a variety of tools that are clearly more appropriate than others. Whilst it's very much on trend to be all collaborative, there's still very much a need for top-down communication in an organization. And for example, an emergency notification, which Rob will talk a little bit later around, the need to do fast information dissemination. An emergency notification requires immediate action. So this is not something you want to read now, read later type approach. So a desktop alert in that scenario would be considered very much optimum. But, this isn't a collaboration tool. It's the organization sending out its messaging to its employees. And it's interesting that certain tools perform well across the entire spectrum. So take tickers, for example. These can be really effective for reinforcing messaging. So behavioral change, again, which we'll come on to a little bit later in this presentation, but also for inciting action. So, for example, asking your staff or reminding your staff to complete a survey now. And so I've just come on to the top communication challenges that we see. So we're going to talk around behavioral change, cultural shift, and fast information dissemination. And I'm going to hand across to my colleague Rob to talk around behavioral change. So Rob, over to you.
All right. All right. Thank you very much, Phil. I think behavioral change, we're all familiar with it. It is essentially altering patterns of accepted and familiar behavior and replacing them, introducing new forms of behavior. As we've all been through mergers and acquisitions and other forms of behavioral change, we know it's one thing to talk about it. It's a very hard thing to do. I think when you talking about changing behavior, it's a multi-step process. And we've put some examples here as we move on to the next slide about some basic examples of what behavioral change might be. Certainly the recent WannaCry malware attack was a scenario where you're trying to change behavior and you're doing it on a global scale and you need to do it quickly. Very difficult to do. Opening up opportunities or whistleblowing or eradicating fraud or internal bullying, changes in policies. Again, you're asking for changes in behavior and it's a multi-step process. I think it requires new operations, new procedures, and constant reinforcement. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because it's a very important part of the process. I think we would all agree that a one-off email from management or corporate simply saying, here's our new policy, please follow it, is typically not effective. So if we can move on to the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about taking a look in detail at the problems. Now, depending upon the study you look at, you will see different numbers, but essentially, this is what it comes down to. Over 50% of all internal communications simply aren't read. There are a number of reasons for that. As Phil talked about, number of resources available, competitive set, the invasion or pervasion of consumer media into the marketplace. The summary is that employees have choices they didn't have years ago. They can choose to engage with corporate publications, or they can jump to consumer media. And consumer media has really invaded the marketplace because we can all pick up our smartphone and choose to look at consumer media instead of corporate media. Now, 70% of all page views last less than 4 seconds. You and I deal with this every morning when we go through our inbox. We look at something, we look at a headline. If it doesn't grab our attention, we click. It's removed to oblivion very quickly. This is interesting. 49% of words are read, or only 49% of words are read on a page with less than 111 words. In the case of a web page, which the average is about 600 words, only 28% of the words are read. So 70% of your content is never even being viewed. And from an internal communication standpoint, having spent 25 years communicating internally, it's a huge problem. So how do we motivate? How do we get employees to react? In addition, smartphones, statistically, a smartphone is checked 150 times a day. We don't even think about it. It's like breathing. Email, we check 30 times an hour. With about 50%, and as we all know, if you've read the stats, you know that an increasing number of employees are not going to be tethered to their desk. How do we reach them effectively? And basically, again, going back to the basic competition for eyeballs within the corporate universe is we're competitive with consumer media. We don't think of it that way. We've not been trained to think of it that way. But the fact is, employees have choices to engage with corporate messaging or choose consumer messaging. So we need to look at consumer messaging and see how and why it's effective if we want to compete successfully against it. So let's talk about changing behavior in a little more detail here. And Phil, if you can kind of advance. People will change their behaviors. We can motivate them, but there are a couple of steps involved that are paramount. If we don't do these, we will not be successful. Behavior must be easy. It's got to be rewarding and normal. So let's talk about what we mean by easy. We're saying to somebody, they already have the skills to do this. There are no obstacles in their way to changing their behavior. They won't get in trouble if they do it. And it's a simple thing to do. Too often we ask people to change behaviors. And it's not native. It's not easy. It's not simple. And I think that part of the trick, or not trick, but part of the objective is to make it normal, a natural transition, a natural evolution. Okay? I think if we haven't taught people the necessary skills, or they've experienced pushback from either their peers or management in the past, makes them reticent to try new behaviors. And I think they're a little bit gun shy about doing that. So I think that making it easy is a very important part of the process. I think rewarding an employee for successful evolution of behavior is really, really important. I think that they need to know that if they're going to change their behavior, they will have results, and those results would be positive. Those results can be on an emotional level, can be on obviously a practical level within their job function. And this is where behavior connects to values. I think you have to show people how behaving in this new manner will support the values that they have or that we want to project. For example, if somebody deeply values having positive human interactions, they're a people person, you help them to understand how a new behavior will support those values and result in a really successful interaction. Normal. Normal is a big word. In order to change people's behavior, they have to feel that people like me act this way. People I admire and emulate act this way. Therefore, this behavior is normal. So projecting that out is really, really important. Nobody likes feeling like an aardvark. But if you can support the premise that behavior in this manner is normal and productive and supported by people that, again, you either value or they are your peers, it will be successful. And I think even if you look at people who are renegades in the corporation, we all have them, they will emulate other renegades because that is a value that they have. Their performance, the way they interact, is something they value, and therefore they emulate. I think the third spoke of this is management. Management must support the process. We have all been through scenarios where, frankly, the typical approach to this is, oh, a new initiative. Okay, we'll wait this out, and we'll see if this sticks. And as we all know, a large, I won't say majority, but certainly a large percentage of initiatives as it relates to new ideas, new behaviors, new normals, employees wait it out. So I think repetition and support is a really important value here. We have a site that we identified that you might want to write this down. It's a McKinsey site. So you go to www.mckinsey.com/hyphen business, well, I'm sorry, / business hyphen functions / organization / our hyphen insights / the psychology hyphen of hyphen change hyphen management #0. Okay, so Phil, if we can move on to a strategy to affect behavioral change. And we've put together a pyramid that really reinforces the behaviors necessary in order to create change, starting with inspiration. It's not nagging, it's not saying people do this. It's showing them what to do and how to do it and explaining the benefits. And as Phil talked about earlier, provide training and ongoing support. Again, people's tendency will be to wait it out. So I think what you want to do is provide training, bite-sized information, reinforce, and repeat. So Phil, now I think here's a case study. This is a company called ArchCare. They have about 14 different senior citizen centers around the country, and they have about 3,000 employees. And they were terribly concerned about cybersecurity, and they wanted to promote a culture of safe online behavior. Again, easy to say, hard to do. So they took an approach of starting with the strategy. They took a campaign approach. They created drip feeds so employees were constantly reminded. They used multi-format messages, both short and long form. They used videos, they used screensavers, they used desktop alerts. You cannot teach an employee everything you want to know or they're going to want to know in one session. So you use multiple sessions, multiple tools, you keep it fresh, you keep it engaging. Again, we have very short attention spans. And so you want to keep it short, fresh, engaging, and to the extent possible, entertaining. Doesn't mean song and dance, but it does mean keeping it engaging so an employee will respond. I think positive reinforcement loops have a conditioned effect. Once established, they'll maintain them. You can leave them be. But again, using a variety of high-impact tools to reinforce the message can be alerts, videos, classroom training, tickers, a variety of different tools to keep that message vital. Screensavers are also a good idea in digital signage as well. Lastly, when that behavior is achieved, you want to reward it. You want to acknowledge it. You want to conform that this is normal, and this is good, and this is positive. So, Phil, if we can move on to the next slide. This is actually Mitzi Amoroso, who's the CIO of ArchCare. And these are really her words, that taking a campaign approach for them has resulted in an effective campaign. They've been successful in changing employee behavior. The awareness of cyber crime, if you will, has been elevated significantly, and they've had no breaches, which at the end of the day is what this is about. So Phil, with that, I'd like to turn it back over to you to talk about cultural shifts.
Sure. Thanks, Rob. So I think we're doing okay on time as well. I'm just checking we're kind of halfway through. So we're going to talk, the second communication challenge that we want to talk around today is cultural shift. So Rob's kind of covered, behavioral change, but looking at cultural shift, well, what is this? Well, this is aligning the ingrained practices, excuse me, and attitudes of employees to the values and strategic objectives of an organization. And it's probably the toughest internal communications challenge. It's a real slow burn, and it's often met with a lot of resistance. And so whilst they're a hard challenge in terms of cultural shifts, the catalysts that drive them are actually surprisingly quite common. For example, a merger or an acquisition. And there's a global movement for consolidation. And I guess speaking from a personal experience, I was at my last company for a period of 10 years, and they were acquired 3 times in that 10-year period. Each of those times brought about a pretty significant change in company culture. Some obviously for the positive, but some unfortunately for the negative, I guess, as well. But either way, that change permeated through every layer of the company, every function, task, process, system, but more importantly, the company's outlook and its values and beliefs. There's also shifts in cultures that are brought on by a change in focus. So, for example, perhaps a new low-cost strategy, or one that's centered around world-class customer service. Well, these don't just involve frontline staff; it applies to everyone in the business for this to be truly effective. And what I find really interesting is that you may or may not be in control of your cultural shift, and therefore you've got really limited or little or zero time to prepare for it. So my last company was involved in the oil and gas business, and one of our customers was BP. And the change following the Deepwater Horizon disaster was quite palpable in terms of how we dealt with BP. And we happened to have what was arguably the safest widget in the market. I won't go into what the widget was, but it wasn't the cheapest, definitely not, but it was absolutely the most safest. And BP's cultural shift towards one of safety first climate drove them to actively prefer our solution over the competition. And I guess for further reinforcement of that, if we just look at the the financial industry, or the emission scandals by car makers, all of these are driving a real fundamental shift in company culture. And we could be that we're changing in strategy. So, for example, we're moving from an outbound model in sales to an inbound model. And lastly, technology can facilitate cultural shifts, and it is facilitating those shifts to one of collaboration, where everyone in the business has a voice. And interestingly, employee-generated content has real authenticity, and that's essential at a time when trust in senior leadership is at an all-time low, or can be at an all-time low. So this is believe it or not, my iceberg. I did work very hard to try and find an orange iceberg. So I hope that you can understand that's what that is. But let's not beat around the bush here. Changing a culture is very hard. It's frustrating. It's intangible, and it's very difficult to see the results. And taking the iceberg reference here, the bulk of a company's culture is the submerged part, and this comprises the shared beliefs and assumptions that are often ingrained and shaped over generations and generations, and this is what drives company culture. But what we can see above the water are the behaviors and outcomes that are the consequences of culture. And change in culture requires us to make changes at the beliefs level, so the bit that's under the water. And this is, by its very definition, significantly more difficult, for example, than an operational process or an information system change. So, but if it's so difficult, then why bother? Well, the results can be pretty significant. So 82% of business leaders viewed culture as a potential competitive advantage. So if you think back to our earlier slides where we talked about the right company culture attracting and retaining the best talent, well, this is only ever going to become more important as people look to find organizations that have the beliefs and values that they want to be part of. But only 28% believe that they understood their culture well, and only 19% believe that their organization has the right culture. So clearly there's room for improvement here. And the classical, when you look at strategies that drive cultural shift, the classical model is 3 stages. So diagnose, reframe, and communicate. So diagnose your existing beliefs and values that exist, reframe them through role modeling and the outward setting of new beliefs and behaviors through to the communication of these new values and behaviors. I have to say, I think this misses a pretty important step, which is the reinforcement of those new values and behaviors. But either way, it's imperative to lead by example. So you've got to be inclusive, all staff group, one-on-one meetings, and ensure the influencers in your business, and you'll all know who they are, those influencers in your business are involved and are on board. And take your message to the road. So you need to be sure to answer the why. People need to be able to picture what's being said so they can remember and then retell. So being creative, storytelling approach here can really help. Of course, you need to communicate progress, so sharing wins and failures is absolutely critical, but you also need to create the right conditions for change. So what I mean by that is, if, for example, the cultural change is to encourage more collaborative teamwork, then perhaps changing the physical office space may affect that more appropriately. And I think Rob alluded to this earlier in our presentation, but it's incredibly important to equip management with the tools that they need to drive strategy through the organization. So when we specifically look at managers, it's often said that people lead managers, not companies. So managers are critical in affecting cultural change. They need to be able to absorb and retell the new values and beliefs that the organization is trying to shift towards. They need to frame up that culture in a way that really resonates with their employees. And I think it's important for them all to be able to walk and talk to understand and appreciate the perspectives that they have. And, clearly there's a huge potential for miscommunication if this layer of management aren't supported in their cascading of information. So don't leave anything to chance. Their vision needs to be absolutely the same vision as that core shift in culture. And, lastly, measurement. You really need to understand how that cultural shift is progressing, what's working, what isn't, and be able to pivot as needed as that measurement and those metrics come in. Okay, so the last topic that we're going to talk around is what we've called urgent message dissemination. And on that, I'm going to hand back across to Rob to be able to talk through this challenge.
All right, thank you, Phil. Unfortunately, the need for emergency communications of every stripe is increasing dramatically, whether it happens to be in stateside, certainly increase in tornadoes and hurricanes, natural disasters, unfortunately. Then we have active shooter scenarios that are becoming increasingly more common. And we increasingly deal with companies that want emergency notification capabilities. I think it's just a sign of the time. And frankly, every second counts. I mean, the first 60 seconds of an event can really determine the outcome. So I think emergency planning has become hugely important. Now, I would suspect that many of you have emergency plans in place, but we just wanted to drill down on this just a little bit to go through the basics of emergency planning. The plan must be defined, okay? Everybody in the organization must understand the plan, their role in it, what they're expected to do. It must be articulated throughout the organization. It needs to be multi-tiered. By that, we're really talking about different systems. Could be systems that ring phones, messages that pop up computers, audible alerts, depending upon your environment. Certainly in a production environment, people are not in front of computers, but you need some sort of cue, whether it's visual or audible, to get people to be aware that there's a situation. They need to understand what their role is, what they're expected to do. Not only do the systems need to be redundant, but you want to run them simultaneously because there is no room for error. I think with all of these channels, you want to have backup. In other words, there will be a manager or a series of managers responsible for disseminating the information or making sure that everyone has seen this information. But for any number of reasons, somebody is off site, somebody's out sick, whatever, you want to make sure that there is always a backup person or people in place to ensure that this emergency notification is distributed. It's also vital that governance be very, very strong on this. You want to make sure that messages are not sent out in error or carelessly, because you don't want an emergency message being sent when it's not truly an emergency, because the next time people may not react and think, oh, it's another false alarm, with obvious effects. So I think that's something that you want to plan for. I think the impact of mobile devices can't be overstated because everybody pretty much has a smartphone in this day and age. So the ability to reach people on their personal devices as well as on their company devices are really important. We have just a quick case study of one client who is a utility company. So they have people at desktops, they have people hanging off poles. They need to be able to reach all of them, especially the people who are on location in the event that there is a weather emergency, these people need to know that, hey, there is a tornado coming or a hurricane, whatever it is, and be able to respond specifically. They need up-to-date information. You know, historically it's been email, but that is not effective anymore for the reasons we all know, and especially people who are in remote locations, on, you know, in trucks or even in production environments. You need to be able to reach them using multiple channels. I think the strategy would be to find a solution that would go direct to employees' devices, be it a tablet, be it a smartphone, be it a laptop, and frankly bypass email. Because as we all know, to Phil's point, statistically 122 emails a day is on the light side. So if an emergency email comes in, it's very, with the best of intent, easy to miss it. So I think you want to look at alternative channels for emergency communications. And beyond that, whenever possible, you want acknowledgement. You want to know that you want to use a tool where the person knows, hey, Rob has seen that message, he's acknowledged it, he's closed out of it, and so that you have metrics, so you know everybody you've needed to reach has been reached with that message. I think if we take a look at the opportunity, let's circle back to Phil's original point about the opportunities that exist today for all of us. I think it's very exciting. There's a lot of opportunities here, and Phil, if we can advance, we're going to jump ahead one. So there, it is in many ways a new opportunity for us, a new playing field, if you will. There's more visibility for internal comms. There's more appreciation at a senior level. Increasingly, internal comms is getting a seat at the table, or certainly having direct input to senior management as its value is being appreciated. At the same time, greater influence sets greater expectations. I think once senior management begins to really realize that internal communications really can move the needle, you will increasingly have a seat at the table, but again, that's going to increase expectations. There is right now really an unprecedented opportunity to make a difference. There are more channels, more creative ways to get employee attention, both online, traditional media, print, certainly digital signage. There are more ways than existed 20 years ago to reach employees, and all of that presents new opportunities. Social networks, huge opportunity to reach employees not only at their desk, but at home or on the go. I think there are multiple studies now that indicate, especially among millennials and Gen Xers, they'll work 24/7. They'll work all the time. They'll look at their emails all the time. You don't want to bombard them, but they're willing to engage after hours. So they take their work with them. And Phil, if you can move on to the next slide. I think this opportunity is on some levels also terrifying, because there's a lot more transparency. When you're successful, you're going to know, you're going to have metrics that validate it. You're going to have responses. You're going to have questions. You'll know, you'll feel it when it's being successful. Conversely, you'll also know when it's not been successful. So wins are bigger, losses tend to be more articulated. And I think, you know, along with a greater responsibility of reaching out to employees across your network, both internationally as well as domestically, there comes a greater risk. Okay, it's more focus on internal comms and your ability to communicate those messages successfully. I think there's another question in terms of social media. All of the collaborative sites, do you just let them go free? Do you let employees say whatever they think is appropriate? Or do you manage them? Do you moderate them? It's an interesting question. I've seen studies that indicate both have been successful. It's kind of interesting. Employees will self-regulate. If somebody starts to take a conversation, take it in a direction it shouldn't go, other employees will respond and put that person back on track. It's been an interesting thing to see. I think we need to make senior leaders accustomed to the value that internal communications brings, because historically they're not. It hasn't been valued in the way that it is today. And I think there's always, of course, a resistance to change. So change is hard, and it goes back to everything Phil was talking about earlier in terms of how you get people to change, snackable content, moving the needle, variety of options. And I think that in general terms, for internal communicators across the globe, diversity rules, but communicating diversely is complex. But in that complexity, it offers opportunities for all of us to really move the needle, make internal communications just an integral part of a company's culture, not just a medium for disseminating information that people tend to ignore. And with that, I think what we'd like to do is open it up to questions. And at the same time, we've enclosed here on this slide, there's an interesting tool that allows you to calculate the cost of your internal communications. We suggest that you use it, experiment with it. There's also a checklist for communicators, which can be very important, very valuable to benchmark your own activities. And there's a ideal starting point for communications ideas. Cool tool. It's called comstools.com. And I would suggest that you bookmark it and add it to your bookmarks and use it from time to time. Just measure, pace yourself, see how you're doing. So on that note, we'd love to have questions for Phil and myself. So I think, Hila, we'll turn it back over to you.
Yes, thank you, Rob and Phil. We did have a couple questions coming through during the presentation about that URL, the McKinsey URL that you shared. I believe that we can send that in the email follow-up. We will also include the presentation deck and recording, just so that everyone knows that. I'm just going to try to go questions by timestamp. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll try to cover as many as possible. So the first question that came in, is it possible to make a real impact if executives do not see internal comms as a strategic role or function?
I think the short answer is, if you can't go top down, which is always preferable, go bottom up. Work with the employees. There will be a groundswell, and that will reach the upper levels. It'll reach middle management, which will transmit it up to senior management. We've worked both ways. If you have top down, it's always preferable. If not, you can work around them, go bottom up. People at the senior level will see the results, and then somewhat grudgingly, but nonetheless, give you the room you need to improve internal communications.
I think, sorry, I just add to that as well. I think I'd also, try and use some of the tools, perhaps in some of the reports that we've looked through in this presentation, to challenge senior management's stance, if you like, on that regard, because my assumption, I don't know the details, but my assumption is that they don't necessarily find the value that we believe is there with real employee engagement. So I think that there are tools, reports out there that are able to link financial reward through to employee engagement. So I would also try and raise that with senior management to make sure that they see the true value of good internal communications and good employee engagement.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next question, what is your philosophy on finding champions to help communicate a change or share information?
Your best practice. Find the champion. Find the hand raisers. They can do a job that nobody else in the organization can do. Those brand champions, call them cheerleaders, call them what you want, will help navigate new messaging into the general population. They are vital. This is especially important when you get into M&A activities and you're combining different cultures and people are confused, they're not sure where they stand, they're not sure what the normal behavior is. This is where a brand champion, again, or a local cheerleader, can help transmit that message and spread it among the troops. And it has a kind of honesty because they're a colleague as opposed to senior management coming down that perhaps they feel doesn't understand their needs. It's very different when it comes from a colleague. Yeah, I would encourage that in the strongest sense.
Okay, the next question, what is the definition of a ticker?
Phil, you want to respond to that?
Well, I guess the definition of our ticker is effectively a scrolling news feed, which scrolls across your screen in some way, whether that be at the bottom, the side, the top, etc. But it's think of your news feeds that you get on the news programs that you have. So the CNN, the BBC, depending on where you are in the world, they'll scroll a whole headlines through the bottom of the screen. And certainly from our point of view, it's actually a really effective tool to be able to get information across to your employees, but they can choose whether they want to engage with that. It doesn't take focus from, whatever they happen to be working on or in. They can look at that, they can absorb that information as it scrolls across the bottom of the screen, and then they can, if it's one of our products, for example, then they can click on that, they can get more information and so on. So I think in a broadest sense, then a ticker is really just a stream of information that is absorbed by the individual, which they can then engage with as they need to.
Okay, great. The next question. You mentioned emergency communication via the utility case study, but there wasn't a mention of actual communication platforms used. I'd be interested in what alternative methods were used and how you verified folks actually read it.
Depending upon well, Phil, you want to respond, or you want me to?
Yeah, again, so from our point of view, clearly they're using the SnapComms tools to affect the communication with those utility workers. So certainly in our case, they have, all of our tools have the metrics around who's read a message and when they read it, how many times they read it, on what device, where they were, etc., etc. So we get a lot of metrics from our product in terms of being able to understand the effectiveness of a message. So have they been, have they been able to read the message? So have we reached them? And then secondly, once we have reached them, have they then engaged that message? Have we been successful? And certainly in this particular case, the prior communication channel was email, and obviously you can send a read receipt or ask for a read receipt in email, but it's pretty limited in terms of the metrics that you get. And so they had a concern that their staff were overlooking or missing those messages, and so they used our product to send out messages to them. And they used a variety of tools, whether that be a desktop alert or whether that be a ticker and so on. And so, for example, those workers that were out in the field, as Rob mentioned, I think he said they were hanging off poles, which I did like the analogy of that. They're clearly not in front of a laptop or a desktop machine. So in that case, we sent them directly to our mobile app. And obviously that presents on screen, and they consume the message that way. And again, it's measured. We've got the metrics around that, so we can tell if people have read that message or not.
Okay, the next question. What are your feelings about using mobile to reach employees?
I think it can be very effective. Usually it's an opt-in. Most companies are bring your own device. Employees have to be willing to engage with it. I think, look, by 2020, 80% of the workforce is going to be mobile, and they're going to be living on their mobile devices. In fact, I just heard something just the other day. They did a survey in a department store, and they looked for younger people. I would say, let's say in their early 20s. I don't have details, but they simply said, would you shop in a store that didn't have Wi-Fi? And their answer was no, we won't go in a store that doesn't have Wi-Fi. So what we're talking about here is the ability or the universality of smartphones. It is the way the world is going. So if it's bring your own, the cost of a data message is probably 2 cents if you want to send a text message. So I think when you can allay the fears or give employees a stipend of some kind and they opt in, it can be really inexpensive.
I was just going to add that we do come up against how do we engage with companies that have got a mobile base, and from our point of view, if it's a company-owned fleet of devices, then it's pretty straightforward. They can deploy our app onto that device and away we go. They can provide messaging to them. But I think, as Rob alluded to, at the very least, you've normally got a mixture of company-owned mobiles as well as bring your own device. And so what some of our customers have done is been quite creative. So they've only provided content that was available on the mobile device, for example. So they've really encouraged their employees to register or opt in to the service. And they've run, competitions, quizzes, where they need, the only way that they can be engaged with that particular item or that particular piece of content is by using their mobile. So I think it is a challenge, I must admit. If it's a company-owned fleet, straightforward, easy. But if it's bring your own device or there's a mixture of those, then it can become more challenging. But largely, encouragement of your employees via opt-in methodologies and quizzes and surveys and competitions that they engage using their mobile devices, we've seen that be pretty effective.
Okay, great. The next question. We often have to deliver negative messages like bonus cuts or layoffs. How do you make those communications quote unquote rewarding?
That's a tough question. I don't know that you can make them rewarding. I think employees value honesty. I think, again, as a general change, we find that people know what's going on. Even if the company doesn't tell them, they pick up their smartphone or their computer and they see what every financial analyst on the planet is saying about their company. So employees know what's going on. So I think that they appreciate the candor and the honesty. I think what you do is you deliver the bad news, you explain to them why it's happening, and you explain to them, or hopefully explain to them, what you're trying to do to fix the situation.
Yeah.
So I don't think you sugarcoat bad news. I think you just put it out there, but explain how it's happened, why it's happened, and what you're going to do to fix it.
I think that that's really all about context. So Rob, you alluded to that, and we talked earlier in the presentation around we can no longer spin our employees or fudge the metrics because it's very easy to validate corporate messaging or executive messaging. So I think probably even more so now than ever, then it's really important that you're honest and you're transparent in your communications, and you provide the context around that bad news, whatever that bad news happens to be. So the more context you apply, then I won't say the easier it is to consume, but certainly perhaps the more easier it is to understand.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next question, and we'll be able to maybe take about one or two more. Can you speak about video? It's costly but effective. How to best employ it and where it makes the most sense?
Okay. You want to address this, Phil?
Yeah, well, I'll give you my thoughts. And again, I think when people are using video, yes, it's costly, yes, but it is effective, and we find that with our own product. I think I guess the general rule of thumb here is to make sure that your video content is short, so very bite-sized. There's a phrase called microlearning, which is used in the compliance space, where they use a lot of videos as well as other media, for that matter, to drive a particular behavior. In this case, around compliance or a code of ethics and so on. But they very much use videos that are bite-sized, snackable. They are presented to the employee in a way that's easy for them to consume. They don't have to go find it and then sit through an hour's presentation or half an hour's presentation. But increasingly as well, I also think that a video that's really well done is really, really effective. And I know that sounds obvious, but when you see some videos that are, some people have spent quite a lot of money with regard to their production values, but it's just not a particularly effective mechanism. So I think, you really have to seek out the right video platform that's right for your organization, and, whether that be a comedy sketch to communicate some health and safety initiative, or whether it's a more serious message. I think that very much depends on the organization and the corporate tone that you set within your organization. But we certainly see that people using our product with video very often do that very creatively, but it's consistently short. It's always content that's probably a few minutes long. Maybe that's the nature of our tools, but certainly we find that well-made, well-produced short videos are most effective from our customers.
I've seen several studies, one of which indicates that a video message is 60 times more effective in reaching employees or having them retain information than giving them the same information in print, because they're so overwhelmed with print. I think video can be great, it can be very powerful. To Phil's point, you keep it short and you pick your topics. But it is the way of the world. The average person watches between 4 and 6 hours a day of television, at least in the States. So video is the new norm. The question is, how do we take advantage of it?
Okay, thank you. And the last question we'll be able to take here. There are quite a few questions that we weren't able to get to, but I believe that you could follow up with Rob and Philip with any further questions you may have.
Sure.
So we can share their email addresses in the follow-up email. And also note, there have been a few more comments about the URLs on the last page. We will be sharing the presentation deck, so everyone will have access to that. So the last question here, we struggle to get budget for improved or new tools. Any tips?
Great question. That's hard.
I think, sorry, Rob, I was just going to, I guess I'd probably refer to my previous answer, which is around, let's make best use of the material and the reports that are out there that show that linkage between, enhanced employee engagement and financial return. Because I think let's assume that the organization is interested in financial return, then I assume if that linkage is made, then I think we can, then I think that budget could be made available in terms of internal communication tools. But I'm oversimplifying, I think, if I'm being perfectly frank here, but I would make use of those reports because they are pretty direct in terms of that linkage they make.
One other thought regarding that, a very inexpensive way to validate that is to do a short study, if you will. Take two groups, use one as a control group, send out information the normal way, and then measure their responses, do a survey, find out what they've retained, what they know, what they don't. With the second group, use more innovative tools, whether it's video, whether it's SnapComms, whatever it is, could even be SurveyMonkey, whatever it is, use it and measure the response. And then you have a story to go back to senior management and say, okay, when we use newer tools, when we use tools and techniques that are in sync with the way our employees receive and process information, here's the difference in the performance or in the quality of the data we get back. I think that doesn't cost anything to do and can validate spending money on internal communications does matter because messages will be delivered more efficiently.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Phil and Rob, for hosting this webinar.
Our pleasure.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for your participation. This concludes today's webinar. Again, we will be sending out the deck, recording, and other information shortly following the conclusion. You may now disconnect.